That's not the submarine that killed them.
For 64 years, the Australian government sold the nation a trophy built from the wrong wreckage. This is the story of how a fortress failed, and how the lie that followed was more successful than the defense ever was. May 1942. For the people of Sydney, the war was a distant tragedy, a headline in a newspaper. The fall of Singapore, the bombing of Darwin, these were catastrophes that happened somewhere else, to someone else. Sydney was different. Sydney was a fortress. This wasn't just a military designation. It was a psychological contract, written in the public's mind. For the people on the street, safety had a sound. The distant clang of a ship's bell, the low thrum of a naval engine. It had a sight, the colossal gray shapes of warships sitting at anchor. The architecture of defense was visible, tangible. A massive steel net, suspended like a curtain across the harbor's mouth. Detection loops buried in the silt. A silent electric tripwire. And on the headlands, the great coastal artillery guns, pointing their barrels out at the empty Pacific. This infrastructure wasn't just defense. It was a promise, cast in steel, that the war would stay out there.
Torpedoes don't care about promises.
The national mood was one of deep-seated, almost delusional confidence, and it was a confidence that had been carefully manufactured. The newspapers and radio broadcasts were filled with talk of Fortress Sydney. The public was sold a story of an impenetrable harbor, a bastion of Allied power in the Pacific. They believed it because they were told to believe it by the very institutions meant to protect them. War was something to be consumed passively in a Sunday picture show because the real danger, they were assured, could never reach their doorstep. The first warning came 2 nights before the attack. A Japanese seaplane flying low and slow, just 300 meters over the harbor. This wasn't a stealthy reconnaissance run. The pilot flew with his navigation lights on, a pair of bright, steady eyes in the darkness. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a gesture of supreme confidence. It was the enemy taking a casual, unhurried tour of their target, not to see if it could be breached, but to decide which prize to hit first.
The plane was spotted. A report was filed by the Middlehead Artillery Battery. The system, on paper, had worked.
Right. So the alarm bells are ringing.
The report died on a desk at Garden Island Naval Base. The officer of the watch dismissed the sighting. It was, he concluded, probably a friendly American aircraft. The city's blackout order was delayed by the man in charge, Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould, and as a catastrophic result, the entire Allied fleet, including the prize target USS Chicago, was perfectly silhouetted against the bright lights of the city. A fleet of sitting ducks in a beautifully lit shooting gallery.
So, just to be clear, they saw an enemy reconnaissance flight and decided the best course of action was to put the kettle on?
The human error was compounded by physical neglect. The much-vaunted anti-submarine net was still under construction, riddled with gaps a submarine could easily pass through. The last line of defense was the electronic detection loops on the seafloor. But there was a problem. 4 months before the attack, the Admiral's own hand-picked anti-submarine expert had formally warned him that the loops were deficient, that they wouldn't work as intended. The warning was noted, and then it was ignored.
So the man hired to check if the alarm system worked said the alarm system doesn't work, and they filed that under minor administrative detail. Good to know.
At 8:15 p.m., A single urgent phone call from a civilian watchman cut through the quiet of the naval depot. A submarine, sighted inside the harbor. That call started a clock, and for the next 2 hours and 15 minutes, that clock was the only thing that moved. 135 minutes, the report sat on a desk. The harbor lights stayed on. No general alarm was raised to the fleet. The city continued to glitter, oblivious. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, it became an action in itself. A decision made through inaction to do nothing at all.
And the man who was meant to be the central nervous system of that fortress, Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould, was enjoying dinner ashore. This is the critical, damning detail. He had personally studied the catastrophic 1939 German submarine attack on the British fleet at Scapa Flow. He understood, better than almost anyone in the country, the exact nature of this threat. And yet, on the one night his expertise was desperately needed, he was unreachable, out of the loop. A 2-hour window was not just gifted to the enemy by paralysis, it was created by the absence of the one man who should have known better.
An existential threat to the nation's largest city should never be allowed to interfere with a well-deserved meal.
The first intrusion ended not by skilled defense, but by enemy desperation. The midget submarine M27 became entangled in the incomplete net. After a 2-hour debate by a patrol boat crew about whether it was a sub or just debris, the 2 Japanese sailors inside chose to take their own lives rather than be captured. But there were others. Minutes before M27 was even spotted, the detection loop registered the second submarine, M22, entering the harbor. The technology worked perfectly. The watch officer, once again, dismissed the signal as ferry traffic. When patrol boats finally converged on the location, they began dropping depth charges.
So they found the submarine, and they had the depth charges. I'm almost impressed. Let me guess. Wrong size?
The depth charges were set to 15 meters, the standard for submarine warfare in the deep, open ocean. In the shallow, muddy confines of Sydney Harbour, they were less a weapon and more a form of violent, pointless theater. The explosions threw up huge plumes of water, but the shock waves dissipated uselessly. One charge detonated so close to the surface that it blasted the stern off HMAS Yandra, the very boat that dropped it, injuring 2 crewmen. The defenders were now literally attacking themselves. And in the middle of this deafening, self-inflicted chaos, M24, the real threat, slipped past them like a ghost.
So the thinking was, we can't find the submarine, but we have all these explosives. It would be a shame to waste them. Flawless!
It was midnight. M24, the ghost in the machine, fired 2 torpedoes at the USS Chicago. Both missed. The second torpedo passed silently under a Dutch submarine and slammed into the dock wall directly beneath HMAS Kuttabul. The Kuttabul wasn't a warship. It was a relic, a retired wooden ferry given a second life as a floating dormitory, a place that smelled of old timber and salt air. On board, men were winding down, a quiet game of cards under a dim light, a letter being written home, the gentle rocking of the harbor a lullaby. It sank in minutes, swallowing 21 men in the dark, 19 Australian, 2 British. They weren't killed on a battlefield, they were killed in their beds, in the one place they had every right to believe they were safe. This is the part of the story the official reports gloss over. The Kuttabul wasn't a warship. It was a home, a place where men off-duty read letters from their families, played cards, slept. They believed they were in the safest place in Australia. The torpedo didn't strike a military target. It struck a promise. And in a fraction of a second, the tranquility of the harbor was replaced by a nightmare of splintered wood, twisted metal, and freezing water.
The final tally was brutally asymmetric. On the Allied side, 21 men dead, without a single shot fired in their own defense. On the Japanese side, the 6 crewmen of the 3 midget submarines perished as combatants. The Allied men died in their pajamas.
A fortress so safe that the most dangerous place in the city turned out to be your own bed.
And M24, the submarine that had killed 21 men, vanished back into the Pacific. Undetected, unhindered. In the cold light of the following day, with the wreckage still smoking and the death toll confirmed, the men in Canberra faced a choice. Not a military choice, but a political one. They could admit to a catastrophic, humiliating failure of command, a failure that went right to the top, or they could construct a victory. It was a choice between public accountability and institutional self-preservation. They chose to preserve the institution. The truth was deemed too costly. A lie was more convenient. The wreckage of the 2 submarines that failed, M27 and M22, were salvaged from the harbor floor. From their shattered hulls, a single composite submarine was built, a Frankenstein's monster of a war trophy. It was sent on a triumphant national tour, a roadshow of resilience to raise morale and sell war bonds. The tour was a masterstroke of propaganda. The submarine, mounted on the back of 2 massive trucks, became a traveling shrine to a manufactured victory. It crawled through the main streets of rural towns. It was parked in front of town halls for official ceremonies. Local brass bands played. People bought war bonds on the spot. It was the physical embodiment of a lie, something you could touch and have your photo taken with. The government didn't just tell a lie, they put it on tour, turned it into a beloved memory, and made the entire nation complicit in the deception.
You have to admire the logic. If you stapled 2 failed exam papers together, does that make it a pass? According to the Australian government in 1942, yes, it does.
For 64 years, that official narrative was history. It was taught in schools, it was memorialized in museums. The Frankenstein trophy was the final word. A generation died believing the lie. And then, in November of 2006, a group of amateur divers, searching a patch of seabed off Sydney's northern beaches, found something impossible. A shape in the dark, rusted, intact. It was M24, the ghost, the killer submarine that officially never escaped. The discovery wasn't just a piece of wreckage, it was a historical time bomb that vaporized 6 decades of government-sanctioned truth. The system hadn't just failed operationally on the night of the attack. It had failed epistemologically for 6 decades, deliberately erasing the evidence of its own catastrophic incompetence from the historical record.
So why lie for so long?
To admit M24 had escaped would be to admit the fortress was an illusion. It would have caused mass panic and exposed the negligence of high command. The government didn't lie to protect the nation. It lied to protect itself. And that protection was a clinical, bureaucratic process. The Royal Commission of Inquiry, led by a justice of the Supreme Court, was a carefully stage-managed piece of theater. It was held behind closed doors. Key testimonies were suppressed. Its final report was a masterpiece of institutional language, concluding that the disaster was caused by systemic and equipment-based failures. It's a phrase designed to sound definitive while meaning nothing. It assigns blame to an abstract concept, the system, precisely so that no actual human, no high-ranking officer, has to take the fall. The system didn't just bury its mistakes, it wrote its own exoneration.
The club is never wrong, and the most important members are immune to the rules.
The story of the Sydney Harbour attack is not a story of heroic defense. It's a story of how an institution, when faced with its own failure, will construct a more convenient history. They failed to defend the harbor, And then, for 64 years, they failed to tell the truth about it. For the families of the 21 men who died, the official story was a small comfort. That the enemy who killed their sons and husbands had been caught, their vessel displayed as a trophy. The discovery of M24 in 2006 wasn't just a historical correction, it was a second, deeper betrayal. It meant the story they were told, the one they had held onto for a lifetime, was nothing more than a useful lie. The second failure is always worse.
Right. So that's the case file. Another story where the official report is the first casualty. There's always another version of events, another layer waiting to be uncovered. If you want to be there when we dig up the next one, make sure you join the legends on the journey.
The Sydney Harbour attack is a masterclass in how an institution will construct a heroic lie to cover a chaotic, embarrassing truth. But what happens when the failure isn't a loud battle, but the quiet, personal collapse of the man at the very top?
The system doesn't just bury its own mistakes. It buries the mistakes of its leaders. And in this case,
He's got the package.
it seems they buried the leader too.
To open the case file on Australia's greatest political mystery, the Prime Minister who vanished, and the story of the man who drowned twice, click on the video on your screen now.